Final Fantasy XIV has 22 combat jobs, including Blue Mage, and each of them have various weird little things about them, whether it is a little history lesson or a trick you can use. I will give one fun fact about each of the jobs in a random order, and if you remember a random fun fact about a job, be sure to let me know about it in the comments. Samurai. Hagakure is a very weird action that you mostly use for management purposes. Effectively, it is there because sometimes you'd prefer to not have as many sen as you happen to have at that very moment, and can be handy for adjusting the timing of your rotation sometimes. This was a lot more common in Endwalker before Tsubamegaishi had its cooldown removed. Originally though, this was a 40-second cooldown that gave twice as much Kenki per sen, at a time where Kenki was also a bit more valuable point for point. This meant that while sure, Midara Setsugeka is cool and all, dumping sen into this meat grinder was often more effective because you could spend that Kenki while performing GCDs. Dark Knight. When Shadowbringers reworked Dark Knight, Blood Weapon was made into a 10-second buff that made GCD actions recover MP. This meant that Dark Knights needed a certain amount of skill speed and to properly late weave Blood Weapon to be able to sneak 5 GCDs inside the buff window. This was sort of also the case before Shadowbringers, although back then, Blood Weapon itself also reduced the Weaponskill GCD specifically. Early on in Endwalker, Blood Weapon was changed to last 15 seconds and simply give 5 stacks instead, 3 stacks now. Before this change, however, for AoE situations, it was actually quite involved to get the maximum MP out of Blood Weapon due to the fact spell speed wasn't really something you'd go for. The way you overcame this detail was that Quietus is a weapon skill, so by making sure at least the 4 first of the 5 GCDs used in Blood Weapon was Quietus, you could fit 5 within the short window. This was of course done by overlapping it with Delirium. Ninja. Before the rework during Shadowbringers, Ninja's ninjutsus were all oGCD. What this meant is that before Shadowbringers, or at least this rework, you weaved things like Ten, Chi, Raiton between 1-2-3 combos. No, that is not a mistake, you did in fact have to triple weave in Ninja's shorter natural GCDs. Considering what other GCDs the job had going for it back then, while probably not entirely accurate, it effectively meant you just did 1-2-3s all the time while weaving in other things, a bit like how Dragoon works. Due to latency jank and the existence of resistance down debuffs like slashing resistance down, which Fume Shuriken benefited from, at certain latency levels, which were not very high by the way, remember triple weaving, Fume Shuriken could actually beat Raiton on raw potency per second invested, because Fume Shuriken was just a double weave. And just for the record, yes, that did mean Doton and Suiton were quadruple weaves. Black Mage. If you think wacky AoE rotations for Black Mage is anything new, you would have another thing coming. While Shadowbringers initially introduced the trait that makes the opposite element free, this trait was level 72 until the start of Endwalker making in level 1. What this meant is that using Flare would drop you to 0 MP with no way to recover beyond awkwardly transposing to ice and waiting for MP unless you had a Thundercloud proc to cast a free Thunder spell, as Umbral Ice 1 did not make ice spells free. This meant that Freeze alone, although with Thunder sprinkled in, was the most effective AoE rotation until level 58, where Umbral Hearts were unlocked and Freeze was changed to grant 1 heart. Take note that back then, Freeze and Flare could be used in the opposite element, and Freeze also maxed out Umbral Ice, meaning your rotation at 58 effectively became like Freeze, Fire 2, Flare, Loop. Although, you might sometimes need to sit in ice to wait for MP to recover enough that you could loop again. But that was of course a convenient time to reapply Thunder as well. Dragoon. Originally, the Blood of the Dragon effect that Gaishkagul provides worked very differently. It was a 1-minute cooldown that applied a maintainable effect that, increased the damage of jump and the removed Spine Shatter dive. It also was what enabled Full Thrust and Chaos Thrust to continue on to Fang and Claw and Wheeling Thrust, which were actions that extended the duration of this effect. This effect was gradually made easier and easier to maintain, culminating in patch 5.1, where the duration started at 30 seconds, while the cooldown was 25 seconds, making its existence as a buff kind of pointless. It also meant that Dragoons in combat effectively always were surrounded by this blue aura, except when it advanced to the red aura. Astrologian. The job used to have two different modes it could switch between, although it could only switch when not in combat, so you had to decide before fighting. Diurnal Sect was the Regen Healer stance, while Nocturnal Sect was the Barrier Healer stance. While in Diurnal, aspected spells applied a regen effect, and in Nocturnal they applied a barrier effect. Aspected Benefic also got a colossal MP cost increase in Nocturnal. What was particularly interesting about this is that the Celestial abilities also interacted with these sects. Celestial Opposition would instead apply barriers in Nocturnal Sect, and Celestial Intersection would apply a regen effect. Which is to say, obviously, the Astrologian we have today is the Diurnal Sect. Originally, Neutral Sect made it so you were in both sects simultaneously, which meant it also applied to the oGCDs. Or, at least I'm pretty sure that was the case. Machinist. Flamethrower's journey so far is probably one of the wackiest to date. Initially, it was reworked to its current function in Shadowbringers at 100 potency, and then Endwalker's potency squish put it at 80, which was barely competitive with the other AoE options, and the fact it had only 2/3 of the range meant that, often, even if it did more potency per second, it often would miss targets, making that irrelevant. This reached its zenith of, I'd say stupidity really, when Dawntrail released and the competing AoE options effectively matched it in potency. Then 7.1 boosted its potency up to 100 and made its range just as wide as the other options, making it now good. Then 7.2 nerfed the competing options. And then now, in 7.3, Flamethrower stands at 120 potency, going from don't bother using it to a gain on toe is absolutely bonkers in such a surprisingly short time frame, considering how long it was just left like it was. Gunbreaker. Originally, Double Down cost 2 cartridges. This fact is relatively well known. However, a more interesting detail is that as the third cartridge slot is unlocked a couple levels before Double Down, as a result, a slightly more compressed burst existed in a very brief level range that, at least before you get the Lionheart combo, got expanded to sort of continue after you get Double Down. Before, Double Down replaced 2 burst strikes in a way, now it only replaces 1. Pictomancer. This job actually does a surprising amount of quote-unquote smoke and mirrors in its functionality. Subtractive Palette claims to convert white paint into black paint, but this illusion drops when you realize this still works if you had 0 white paint when you used it. Similarly, the Living Muse sequence claims to gradually paint things, but practically speaking, it is simply a rotating sequence similar to Astrologian's card draws. And Winged Muse and Fanged Muse just so happen to give you a charge to use Mug of the Ages and Retribution of the Medine. I know that's not a super exciting fun fact, but it is funny to think about, isn't it? White Mage. When Afflatus Misery was originally implemented, it did approximately 3 times the damage of a Glare, not 4. This was, however, at a time where Glare had a cast time of 2.5 seconds, so things like cast attacks did mean Afflatus Misery was a bit better there. Not to mention, unless you used a Lily spell a lot of the time, you would clip your GCD to weave anything. And while a DPS might be able to say, I'll just weave it when it is convenient, healers often don't have that luxury. If healing is needed, then it often can't wait. However, when Endwalker rolled around making Glare 1.5 seconds, Afflatus Misery being only 3 glares in potency became a much bigger problem, And in an interesting twist, by making lilies effectively a damage loss by this metric, also meant White Mage was by extension the weakest healer in terms of MP management, as these free lily spells were considered a hindrance until Afflatus Misery got a potency buff. Monk. With the introduction of the Obey the Balls design of Dawntrail Monk, the power difference between the three forms is very small. At low levels, the final combo step tends to win, but as you level up, the first step takes over, but not by that much until higher levels. Even so, two particular high points of note in this journey is how, at level 50 to 59, without Masterful Blitz, Perfect Balance is so bad that it is actually better to not use it. And then, once Masterful Blitz is learned, to align Tornado Kick and later Phantom Rush with raid buffs, doing one Nadi twice in a row to start a fight tends to be optimal, at least in a single boss fight. And specifically at level 86 to 91, where you have Rising Phoenix, but not Elixir Burst, double Solar becomes the superior opener, because the damage gained from spamming kicks and boot shines is simply so small that the higher potency of Phoenix relative to Elixir Field makes Phoenix superior. At all other significant level caps, either double Luna tends to win, or the amount of raid buffs is small enough that maybe it doesn't matter and you just do Solar Luna or Luna Solar. I'm not going to pass judgment on whether that is true or not, but my guess would be that that case would be closest to level 60, if it's even the case at all. Bard. Venomous Bite, especially, has gone through quite a journey. Originally, when it was learned, it lasted only 9 seconds, and then a trait learned some levels later made it 18 seconds. Wind Bite was also 18 seconds. Then, with Stormblood, Caustic Bite and Storm Bite came in with 30-second durations. Shadowbringers then made Venomous Bite and Wind Bite start at 30 seconds, until Endwalker made all of them 45 seconds. I know the initial 9 seconds doesn't matter that much considering it was a really short level range where it even applied, but it is funny how it worked like that. It also made sense, since it was 9 seconds super early, where you had almost nothing else to manage anyway. Warrior. Originally, Warrior didn't have this huge emphasis on AutoCrits, as Berserk instead gave a colossal 50% damage boost, followed by pacifying the Warrior for a bit, which was removable with Shuna. It wasn't until 4.2 in Stormblood that Inner Release was reworked from being a your beast gauge spenders cost half, to its first incarnation of what eventually became what it is now. Everything is free for 10 seconds, and also everything auto-direct crits. That included auto-attacks and oGCDs and everything. Naturally, Berserk was reworked in a similar way at this very same moment. Berserk simply made everything auto-direct crit. Originally, Berserk didn't even upgrade into Inner Release, meaning they existed together at one point, and, of course, were used together. Red Mage. Mana spenders used to be very different. Notably, before Endwalker, Enchanted Moulinet didn't lead to a magic burst, but then again, the Flare and the Holy also didn't have AoE components. Simply put, the AoE spender style was to use Moulinet up to 5 times in a row. A much more cursed revelation, however, is the fact that the Moulinet combo introduced with Dawntrail is essentially Moulinet 1, 2, 3, but Moulinet 2 slashes twice and Moulinet 3 slashes thrice. And of course, as we all expected, Moulinet 1 also slashes twice, because of course it does. Sage. Toxikon is a very weird action, especially when you see how it develops. When initially learned, it is effectively like Scholar's Ruin 2 with restrictions attached. As you level up, it reaches a point where it is first almost as good as Doses, then just as good as Doses, and eventually it beats Dyscrasia on AoE, making it actually a damage gain to spend the Adder Stings on AoE. This leads to some planning problems as, of course, having a mobility option when you need one is more valuable than a slight damage gain in the moment. But not everyone thinks that far ahead. Viper. due to the slightly awkward matchup of Viper's Reawaken taking over 10 seconds each, and raid buffs lasting 20 seconds, and buff potions lasting 30, while definitely not optimal, Viper, unlike Ninja, might care about skill speed. Unfortunately, probably as a result of how poorly received skill speed on scouting gear usually is, there hardly is any recently viable skill speed gear. However, it would be possible to get the double Reawaken combo under 20 seconds with enough speed, or under 30 seconds for triple. Again, it's not optimal to use skill speed, but as a complete hypothetical just for fun, if Vipers had access to just as much skill speed as Black Mages do spell speed, then a GCD of 2.16 in the current raid tier before getting their speed buff running would be possible. This would make their filler GCD 1.84 once the buff is going. Vicewinder would be 2.2, Uncoiled Fury would be 2.57. Reawaken would be 1.62, and the Generations would be 1.47, assuming of course the somewhat vaguely known lower bound of 1.5 doesn't actually apply. With all this, a full Reawaken combo including Ouroboros would take 9.7 seconds. Dancer. Originally, while functionally not any different, both Standard Step and Technical Step and every action involved with them were labeled as abilities that activated the GCD, similar to how Ninja's jutsus work. Shortly into Endwalker, all of these actions were changed to weapon skills, almost certainly because Reaper's Circle of Sacrifice from Arcane Circle only checked for each party member that landed a weapon skill or spell. It was not before Dawntrail that abilities were also recognized, but this meant that Dancer got changes to its actions to, in a way, buff Reaper. Paladin. Aside from Circle of Scorn, it wasn't until Stormblood before Paladin actually got access to Total Eclipse for damaging AoE attack. Furthermore, Total Eclipse wasn't learned until level 46. Obviously, Paladin still had a way to maintain AoE enmity. The spell Flash just did a whole bunch of enmity around the Paladin, and blinded any enemy susceptible to that. It was solid enough that sometimes you might even flash a single target enemy to be sure. What makes this even funnier is that before Stormblood were the days of cross-class actions, and the only area of effect attack in the cross-class action list was Death Blossom, the one Rogues got at level 42. However, for some reason, no jobs could use any of the cross-class actions Ninja offered. Shadeshift, Goad, Recover TP for someone else, and Death Blossom. Now, the greatest insult here was probably the fact that Gladiator could use Death Blossom, while Paladin could not. So, in a roundabout way, where Gladiator unlocked a spammable AoE attack in patch 2.4, Paladin didn't get one until 4.0. Summoner. While Summoner has by far the greatest amount of their attacks originate from pet potency among all jobs, they also sport the worst relative power between them and their pets, with their pets typically doing about 5/6 of the damage per potency that the Summoner itself deals. This, of course, also means that the fact the recent potency buffs the job received being entirely situated on non-pet actions makes those buffs even more impactful. Scholar. Whenever you use a pet action, like Whispering Dawn, the act of commanding it puts the action on cooldown. However, it is not always the case that the pet actually performs the action immediately. Where this can become really interesting, mostly in the janky tricks kind of way, is that commanding your pet to move somewhere and then ordering an action will cause the pet to move to the commanded spot first, and then use the ability. But even more interesting is that if you send another move command before the first one finishes, the pet will continue to move until it reaches whatever destination you have chosen, before using its action. This can allow you to stockpile, quote-unquote, an action for some seconds. It isn't really necessary for anything, but it is a funny trick. Reaper. The job was surprisingly strong right when Endwalker launched, no surprise there. However, the first patch to introduce any significant job changes that impacted Reaper, the only things that happened was 1. Dancer's steps becoming weapon skills to Reaper's advantage, and 2. Arcane Crest's healing component being cut in half. Which means the first nerf Reaper ever received was a defensive healing nerf, specifically. Also, Arcane Crest has received 0 changes since then. And finally, Blue Mage. The greatest possible Enmity multiplier combination, at least originally, was the combo of Mighty Guard and The Look. Back in the early days of the job, Mighty Guard reduced damage output by a gigantic 70%. So the fact Mighty Guard gave an 11 times Enmity multiplier didn't do that much. Add on top of that, The Look's 8 times multiplier, and roughly speaking, this meant an early days Blue Mage tank was working with an 88 times Enmity multiplier, reduced to, more like 26.4 times a normal Blue Mage's potential after the damage output reduction. Not that it matters much nowadays, as blue tanks now often simply establish and maintain Enmity with White Wind. As it turns out, 4 times your HP times your Enmity multiplier is a lot of Enmity. Which one was your favorite? And do you know of some fun facts, whether they are recent or about something from a long time ago? I would love to hear about them in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally, many of the crafter actions we rely on to do basically anything as a crafter were cross-class actions, which meant to some degree you couldn't choose all of them. For example, Innovation, which increases quality actions, was exclusive to Goldsmith, unless you cross-classed it. This was changed with the Crafter rework of 5.1.